Targeting our economy, Black Lives Matter protesters trying to shut down Chicago's Magnificent Mile retail district, and $15 minimum wage protesters planning strikes at several major airports next week. Now, some here say trying to ground key parts of our economy will backfire on the protesters. Hi, everybody. I'm Dagan McDowell in for Brenda Butner. This is Bulls and Bears. The Bulls and Bears this week, Gary B. Smith, Jonas Max Ferris, John Layfield, along with Morgan Ortegas and Chuck Rocha. And a warning to all you gentlemen ready to take Morgan on. She's in the Navy Reserves, guys. John, you say protesters targeting our economy will backfire on these protesters.
Yeah, I do. Look, Dr. King, I think, was one of the greatest men of our country. I wish he had lived to be 100 years old because he did so much in the little time that he was here on earth. But his protests were not militant. His protests were not harassing of innocent people that were just coming by to shop in a store. And I think you lose the message. Well, people take Black Friday off to go shopping. If they go down and they can't get in there and they're being called names for trying to go into a store that, by the way, has nothing to do with what they're protesting, I think it hurts the message. Look, I'm very sympathetic to these protesters. The protest of the Magnificent Mile is over Laquan McDonald's death, where a police officer was indicted, a superintendent was fired over the alleged cover-up. I agree with what their cause is. They want an elected civilian committee to oversee the police. I agree with that, but I think it's lost when they start doing things like protesting on the Magnificent Mile, and their message that they have, which is good, is lost as well.
Morgan, do you think it'll backfire?
I do. I agree. I think that there's a lot of ways to get your message across, and even to those of us who are sympathetic to the message, there's a lot of ways to get it across other than sort of ruining everybody's holiday. You know, we've had a really tough and divisive election, and I think people wanted to spend time with their family over Thanksgiving, over the weekend, and it just adds more to the angst of people that are trying to shop. So, again, you know, I think there's other ways to do it to be peaceful without sort of ruining everybody's holiday, but I am sort of sympathetic to what they're trying to do.
And Chuck, please explain to me how blocking the entrance to a crate and barrel pushes your message about whatever you're trying to protest.
Well, they teach us that in Protest 101. You don't protest in the middle of the night when there ain't no cameras around. All the cameras are on the Magnificent Mile today, so they want to get some attention to a very important issue that John and others have talked about being a good issue, and I think that that's a smart tactic, and they teach us liberals that in Out 101 on how you go out and you do this piece. I don't think this will hurt the businesses. I think the businesses won't stop anybody from going into Tiffany's or spending a lot of money. I think what's hurting them is the Internet. On Thursday alone, a report was put out this morning that $1.15 billion was spent on the Internet. I don't think a few hundred protesters are going to hurt a bunch of rich folks down in Chicago.
Gary B., one thing about this is there are a lot of these pile-on causes, and people at home watching this, even if your shopping isn't disrupted, you wonder what they're protesting.
Exactly, but you quickly get over that and figure out that, my God, I can't get into the crate and barrel. I'm going crazy. Look, we are stressed out enough during the holidays. I disagree with Chuck. He says, oh, my gosh, it's not going to prevent anyone. Like, we just walk through the crowd. Listen, if there's people yelling and shouting out there, I got news for you. I'm at the corner. I see those people. I turn around and go someplace else, or I don't shop at all. So, one, it's going to hurt the business. Two, I am convinced these protests help only one group, and that's the protesters. They feel good about themselves. Chuck is right about one thing. They do get a lot of TV coverage, but I'm betting most people tune in and then, oh, yeah, there's people protesting. Who cares? And they move on. Unless it affects you personally, 99% of the people, just like Occupy Wall Street, 99% of those people that were watching the Occupy Wall Street wondering, like, why can't I get into my Apple store today? That's what they care about. That's why this stuff is foolish. And it doesn't make any sense.
But some protests do often work. You had that threatened strike at the Philadelphia airport. Remember that, Jonas? That kind of moved ahead the effort to unionize there. And you're going to have similar protests next week. Again, when you target, say, the airlines, that sometimes does work.
Well, when you're at an airport, you have time to read things. These protests are in front of a Victoria's Secret. I think that's a good way not to have someone read the sign you're holding in front of the store. But I will also say it really depends what you're protesting. To bring up the MLK reference, you know, we have a path to voting for a lot of these things that is very successful. Look at all the states that added more minimum wage increases, for example. I don't think the average person who's shopping thinks that that's something you can't achieve locally with your elections. You know, black people had a problem that wasn't vote-outable, basically. They really needed to protest, and if they got violent to protest, I think people still ultimately sided with them. Some of these protests are on things, you know, you don't like who won the election. that's something you should be voting your way out of. You don't need to protest your way out of that. On the other hand, the situation with police and black people is a protest great thing. The protests I've been reading, they haven't been blocking the economy. I think if people went to the museum after Thanksgiving with their family, that's where the protesters would be. It's not they're trying to destroy the economy. That's where the people are. It's like, why'd you rob the banks, Dillinger said. It's because that's where the money is. I mean.
But, John, do you think this does have an economic impact?
It has to. Listen to what Gary B. just said. You have people that are going out there and deciding, you know what, this is too much trouble. I'm just not going to go into this store. And if you realize that next Tuesday they're talking about a strike in Chicago Airport, people are not going to fly through Chicago Airport. I fly about 4 days a week. I would plan around that. So, yes, it does hurt. And the message of the protesters, I think, is what is lost. They're talking about protesting the $15 minimum wage when you talk about the strike in Chicago. The problems in Chicago are so much deeper than the minimum wage. You had 600 murders as of last month. That is more than New York and L.A. combined, plus 100. The issues there have much more to do with just wages in that inner city than they do with, if you can increase them, doesn't stop the generational issues of both poverty and incarceration.
Gary B., we've seen so many $15 minimum wage protests in the past, sponsored by the unions, and the very candidates who were backing this didn't get elected.
Yeah, exactly. Look, I think that people hear it, maybe to Jonas's point, they think about it, but you know, it's kind of like all politics is local. I think all politics is personal. If you're out there and you're one of those people making $12 an hour, you care about moving to $15 an hour. But that's not most people. So you go, yeah, well, okay, and then you move on, unless, as a few people point out, it's on the ballot. As far as, by the way, losing business, I definitely think people lose business. Look, if you're walking down the street and you see 200 people in front of the restaurant you want to go to, particularly in Chicago where you have thousands of choices, I got news for you. A lot of people, especially with a family, are turning around and they're going to another place down the block.
Yeah, but Dagan, I think the people that are affected most are actually the employees of these businesses, whether it's the protests in Chicago or at the airport. You're actually affecting the people who are making the hourly wage. If you go into Magnificent Mile in Chicago, it's all ages, all races, all creeds who are employed inside of these retailers, and they're the ones whose paycheck is being disrupted. If you go to the airport, it's the same story. So we often look at it and how is this affecting the bottom line revenue of business, but I think sometimes we miss that these protests actually really hurt the individual who's making an hourly wage, who these protests claim they're trying to help.
Yeah, Chuck, it hurts the people who need those jobs, who got to get to work. Get out of my way.
Well, that's a great point. At the Chicago airport, the people that actually come down and get your grandmother in the wheelchair are making like $8 an hour. We should be making sure that we can pay people a living wage. Speaking of an election, we just had an election where a man got elected and said, let's make America great again. There's a lot of people in middle America who feel like they've been left behind, and the government and rich people don't want to speak to them or do anything for them. So this is exactly the condensation that's out there right now, where people want a voice in their government, and they feel like a good protest is the way to do that.
Jonas?
I think after what just happened in the elections, a lot of left-wing people particularly need to rethink strategies that may have worked in the 60s that may not be appropriate today to getting their policies achieved.
Well, somebody explained to me with all these protests why we've got record highs on the stock market day after day after day in the last week. Gary B.?
Well, I'll tell you what, I think most people out there, particularly on Wall Street, the big hedge funds, they're saying, my gosh, we're not going to collapse. We're not Venezuela. Everything looks pretty good out there. And the actions that Trump has taken in the past few weeks, you'd say, my gosh, he's not a lunatic. That's all upside. I think that's what the market is voting for right now.
John, I'm going to give you final word. So we're not Venezuela. Yay!
Yeah, and the best thing that Gary can say about our president-elect is he's not a lunatic. That's incredible.
Well, it made us all laugh, right? Thank you, guys.